Hello, and welcome to the BYU Family History webinar series. I'm Marin, and I'll be your host for this webinar. Please make sure that your microphones and web cameras are disabled during the presentation to provide a smooth webinar. Our upcoming webinars are on Wednesday, June 12th, and Thursday, June 13th. And both of those will be at 3 p.m. Mountain Daylight Time. If you would like to access a previous webinar, please visit our webinar index on our website or search on our YouTube channel. All of our webinars are recorded and provided the following Monday for your convenience. We also post links to recordings and other updates on our Facebook and Twitter accounts. During the webinar, if you have any technical difficulties, please use the chat box and I can address your concerns. You're welcome to use the chat box during the webinar for comments and insights. However, all questions will be answered at the end of the presentation. For today's webinar, we will be pleased to hear from Tina Kirkham, who will be giving a presentation on Utah Digital Newspapers, the Utah Digital Newspapers Project. This recording is a re-recording of Tina's presentation that was given on March 19th, 2019. Due to the poor audio quality during that presentation, we are doing an updated version with more current information on the Utah Digital Newspapers Project. If Tina's ready, we'll turn the time over to her.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very excited to have this time to share our digitized newspaper repository with you. It's called Utah Digital Newspapers, and it is published by the Marriott Library at the University of Utah in Salt Lake City. Today, we'll be taking a quick tour of that website and talk about some of the content that's available in historical newspapers that will be relevant to your family history work. So the Marriott Library has been digitizing newspapers for nearly 20 years. Our website is freely available on the internet. There are no subscriptions or fees. The resource that we have now has over 3 million newspaper pages in it, and those are coming from 165 different Utah newspapers. So the site is big and complex, and we'll take a little bit of time today to do a search or two to get you familiar with it, and then we'll go on and talk about the content in the actual newspapers. We'll wrap up by giving you a sneak preview of what's coming up. In other words, what is being digitized now and will be available to you later this year. So you'll be getting a sneak preview of that content. So let me just jump right in here. We're going to talk about Utah Digital Newspapers and what's in it. You'll see a lot of examples. We'll talk about how newspapers can help you with family history research. We'll go over some tips for effective searching in a resource like this, and then we'll move on to that sneak preview at the end. So just a little background, I wanted to share with you the number of newspapers that we're publishing in Utah over time. So from left to right, the first 30 years of Utah territory, the next 30 years, and then a 50-year stretch. So this stretch, 1900 to 1950, obviously had the most newspaper activity. So the most newspapers were started and were running during this time period. Whoops, sorry, I'll go back. Then we see a drop-off about 1950 and a steep drop-off about 2000 until we get down to about 44 newspapers in existence in Utah today. So this pattern, this sort of step up and down pattern exactly matches the history of newspaper publishing in the United States as a whole. So there's nothing special about Utah. It really followed the exact same pattern as other states. Now, of the 600 or so newspapers that were ever published in Utah, and remember some of them only lasted a few weeks, others lasted for 100 years, but overall there have been about 600 total that ever existed since 1850. We believe that fewer than 15% of that content has been digitized. This number is not something that I can vouch for because we don't have a good way of measuring this number. We know that 600 newspapers were published. We know that we have digitized part of 165 of those newspapers, but that's not really a very clear indication because we haven't digitized every piece of those 165 papers, and some of the ones we haven't digitized may be among the larger dailies that existed. So getting that count, answering the question, how much of Utah newspaper history has been digitized, is actually very difficult. So the best we can do is an estimate. So our current estimate is about 15%, and we want to see that proportion of the pie grow over the coming years. And we actually have deals in place to ensure that it does grow. So one of these days, we hope that that slice will be much larger. Okay, so I mentioned that we have 165 different newspapers in our repository. When I get into the website, I'll show you this list. You can see where it says paper at the top. This is actually a way for you to control and limit your search results, but it's also a quick way to see every single title that we have. So 165 newspapers are represented on our website. This is the yellow and blue logo for our website. This yellow beehive logo is this is our homepage, and you'll find it at digitalnewspapers.org. And I'm actually going to go there now, and we're going to take a quick tour of the site. Let's see if we can get it to work. Okay, so this is the Utah Digital Newspapers homepage, the blue and yellow. I'm going to talk a little bit about what's available here. Down at the bottom, you'll see what we've most recently added to the site. You'll also see announcements of new information about the site. But what I want to focus on really is three things here at the top. This browse menu will open up another area of the site where you can browse the digital newspapers that we have on the site by county. So if you click on a county, it'll expand, and this will tell you what newspapers we have digital content for. Go on to Box Elder. You can also click the counties over here and see them show up. The second thing I wanted to show you is this paper scanned page. This is another way of looking at the same information. The titles that we have represented on our site are listed here. Again, they're organized by county, and the counties are in alphabetical order. But what's different here is that you can actually see what the time period is. In other words, for the Beaver Press, what issues do we actually have? We may not have every single issue. Looks like we have quite a bit, something starting in about 1908 and continuing the Beaver Press all the way through about 2008. So that's a very, very good run of that newspaper. In other cases, you're going to see shorter runs, like this Corinne Journal Reporter in the 1870s. Now, maybe this paper didn't run any longer than that. Maybe it ran longer, but there are no surviving issues. Or maybe it ran longer and there are surviving issues, but we haven't gotten around to extending our coverage of it yet. And when we get to the end of this slideshow, I'll talk about what we're going to be adding to this website and how much you're going to see this whole timeline fill out with much more content. Then the third thing I wanted to show you on our website is at the very top here, the contact. If you click contact, you'll just come to a form. We just ask you to type in your name. You even can just put your first name if you want, an email address where we can contact you. And in here, in the message box, type in a question or a comment or a request. We read these. They come in directly to my manager, Jeremy Minty, and myself. We read them every day and we respond as soon as we possibly can. So I would encourage you, if you want to communicate with us, this is a great way to do it. Okay. So we talked about that. I'm going to go back to the homepage and get us into what I call the database. So this is the sort of the meat of the website. This is the repository or the database. It's this gray and yellow part. It's gray and yellow because it shares code with other digital collections that Marriott Library produces. So although you're looking at only digital newspapers here, this red and yellow and this search box, red and gray and this search box are things that will be familiar to you if you look at other digital collections that we publish, things like diaries and photographs. But here we're at newspapers.lib.utah.edu, so that means you're looking only at our digital newspaper collection, which we call Utah Digital Newspapers. So obviously I think you know how to do a search. And you can type in anything in this basic search box and click the magnifying glass. Obviously, the term railway is going to bring up many, many thousands of results. And it's actually bringing up over 400,000, which of course is way too many to deal with. Here at the left, these items, which you can open or close if you wish, are facets or filters, and they're a way for you to narrow down your search results. So if you wanted to just look at the first, say, 10 years of Utah territory and look for the word railroad, I'm not even sure it will appear because that's pretty darn early, but we can certainly check. I'm going to go ahead and go to 1861. Here it is. Click Update, and you'll see that this number of results has dramatically reduced to 179. This actually surprises me. It's more than I thought, because I don't know that there were railways in Utah this early, but obviously there were railways elsewhere in the United States, so they are being talked about in the newspaper. Here, in this facet or filter, you can actually narrow your results further down to a given newspaper. The Valley Tan is one of the very first papers ever published here after the Deseret News. And so we see that we have 10 articles from the Valley Tan that mention the word railway. So that's useful, maybe of limited usefulness. As I click these X's, I'm removing my filters and going back to the original search result set. But one thing I wanted to make sure you understood was that you can really control your searches and do more powerful searches if you go directly to our advanced search. I don't know if you remember what Boolean searches are, but they're when you combine terms with and or and not. And with these 4 layers here, you can create a very complex search. I don't actually recommend that until you become very familiar with the content in here, because every time you choose another one of these lines or variables in your search, you're actually reducing your search results a bit more. So it pays to get to know this a little bit. But one thing that I would throw out very quickly is the usefulness of proximity search. I'm going to imagine that I have an ancestor named John Miller, who I think worked on a railroad at some point. So if I type in these 3 words and I choose proximity search over here at left, then I choose, I'm going to say within 10 words. So if I chose within 50 words, I could find 3 articles, one that mentioned somebody named John, one that mentioned somebody named Miller, and another one that mentions a railroad. But what I really want is to find a John Miller who's associated with a railroad. So I'm going to go ahead and choose within 10 words, because that's going to increase the chances that I'm going to find a single article that talks about a man named John Miller and talks about the railroad. So this is just one possible way you can do a search, and it can be very useful sometimes. So let's go ahead and do that search. I'm not going to limit the date range right now, and I'm going to search every newspaper that we have in Utah Digital Newspapers. So if you can see from this list, this is all 165 of our titles, all the way down to the Women's Exponent at the end. So I'm going to go ahead and search them all. Now, if I wanted to, I could unclick this and then search only newspapers that I'm interested in. Say I know he was in Beaver County and I don't want to see any other papers except these 3. That's an option also. But for this search, we're going to go ahead and click all of the newspapers. And I'm going to go ahead and click Submit so that my search is submitted. So my results come back. This is pretty good. 32 out of a total of 3 million pages is pretty darn good in terms of the number. Now, one thing is I noticed that the time frame for these results, they start in 1872 and they end in 1959. But my John Miller, the man I'm looking for, died in about 1920. So I'm actually going to get rid of results that are after that. I'm going to go ahead, I'll go to 1922 and click Update. So now we saw our 32 results reduced to 25 because we're here in the time frame or in his lifespan, basically. And then the other thing that I'm going to do is I know that, well, at least the family story is that John Miller worked on the railroad in Ogden. So I'm going to go ahead and look at these Ogden options. So Ogden Daily Standard, there's 3 here. Grand jury indicts the road. In other words, the railroad is in trouble legally. Railroad men to cross to France, 1917. I don't think that could apply to my John Miller because he was a very old man at that point. Husband and wife meet tragic death in 1919. Well, I know my John Miller died in 1920 or 1921, and I also know he wasn't married. So I'm going to eliminate those results. What I'm going to do is go back up here and turn off that Ogden Daily Standard. And I'm going to go back down to this list of papers and click the other Ogden paper, Ogden Evening Standard, 1912. So this is looking more promising because this is during his working life. And in fact, there's only one article from the Ogden Evening Standard that includes John Miller and railroad within 10 words of each other. So let's check this out and see what happens. So I've come to this particular article. It's showing in the viewer window here. Over at right are the contexts for the whole issue. So I can move through different articles and different pages by clicking over here. But you can see that the search engine has highlighted the terms that I was looking for. John Miller and railroad are highlighted. And there's a very small little notice here among other small notices in this newspaper. But it says that our John Miller was arrested. Strikebreaker arrested. He was employed at the local railroad, was arrested on petty larceny. He's accused of stealing a suit of clothes belonging to L.H. Jarvis, another strikebreaker. So there's a lot of wonderful information in here. Peter Nayland, the officer, is mentioned. Our John Miller is mentioned. Unfortunately, he committed a crime. The victim is mentioned. We have learned that there are strikebreakers in Ogden at this time. We've learned that the names of 2 of those strikebreakers, and we've learned that our John Miller was indeed in Ogden in 1912, January 1912. We've proven that. So this is really interesting, and you can see from all these other little tiny announcements in the paper. Mrs. F.W. Easton left yesterday for Idaho. The city physician in Ogden was a woman named Anna Reese. And she talks about a man named Mr. Heap who needs to be moved to the hospital because he's apparently an addict of some kind. More information, we have wedding licenses announced here. So I guess I'm bringing this up because these sort of little teeny tiny things that look like there's nothing special going on, there's no big deal, it's not an obituary, it's not an announcement that somebody was elected mayor. But even in these tiny little announcements, there's really great information. And I did want to show you how that proximity search can really reduce your results to things that may be more relevant for you. Okay, so I think I'm going to go ahead and go back to the slideshow. I wanted to point out very quickly, this is the viewer window, so you can see either articles or whole pages in this window. I'll just open a whole page so you can see what that looks like. And in this window, you can zoom in or zoom out. Here's the plus sign to zoom in so you can get really close and read all the text on here. If you grab this little double arrow and then grab the hand, that allows you to move the item within the window. So instead of using these clumsy scroll bars, you can actually drag it around and read. You can download this entire page. If you are at a particular article, I'm going to go back to an article right now, if I can. You can download a single article. This is the download button here at the upper right. You can also print. And whatever you see in the window here is what will print. So it may be a whole page, and it may be just the article that you're showing. So I hope that's useful. I'm not going to go into too much detail about usability of UDN because there's a lot that can be shown here, and I don't want to use up all the time. I'm going to go back to my PowerPoint slideshow now, and let's keep going and see what we can find. So we just did our quick tour of UDN. This is a wonderful quote from William Allen White. William Allen White was a journalist who ran a newspaper in Kansas for many years. This quote is really beautiful. Our papers, our little country papers, seem drab and miserably provincial to strangers. Yet we who read them read in their lines the sweet, intimate story of life. It's quite beautiful. William Allen White was a journalist who trained a whole generation or two of other journalists. So what we think of today as serious journalism with research and eyewitness accounts and protecting your sources and writing well, editing well, all of those things, it kind of emerged from this era, William Allen White's era. So he was one of the people who sort of created the modern profession of journalism in the United States. He's a very important figure. And this is a wonderful book this quote is from called Hometown News. Okay, so you are all genealogists. I know you know that the newspapers are full of birth announcements, death announcements, and marriage announcements. So we're going to get that out of the way real quick because I know you already have seen these things. So here's a list of deaths in a particular location, births or a birth, and some marriage licenses. And of course, I know you know that when you scan these, you can find, or search, you can find your relatives, your ancestors' names here and learn all kinds of things about them. When they died, what they died of, who they were related to, where they were living, what they did for a living, who had a child, what the gender of that first child was, and who married who, and where those folks who were marrying each other, where they originated from. So tremendous amount of information that's sort of the nuts and bolts of genealogy, or at least the nuts and bolts of building a tree. And I think you guys know pretty much all about that. So it's needless to say there are hundreds of thousands of these announcements in our website. So searching, maybe using the proximity search that I showed you, marriage within 10 words or within 50 words of your two surnames might bring up an article like, an article like this one. So I'm not going to spend too much more time on that because there's so much else to talk about today. So there was a section in the newspapers that was called business cards, or sometimes called just professional. They're a little bit like classified ads, except they're a little bit more elaborate. They take up more room than a classified ad. They use bigger type. They use some decorative features. Here's these dots here, and here this guy is using multiple different font styles to show off what he's advertising here. So they're like classified ads, except they were more expensive. And because they were more expensive, you typically see them taken out by professionals. So doctors, lawyers, dentists, successful business people, people who had some resources and had some money, who could afford to advertise in this way. And one of the things they paid extra for was the placement. These columns, professional business cards, typically appeared on the front page, one of the most prominent places on the newspaper. And we don't typically today in our newspapers, we don't see ads on the front page, but it was actually quite common in the older days to have ads on the front page. This was a great source of revenue for for a woman who was running that newspaper. And this individual would buy this space and this phrasing for a certain period of time. He might buy, say, a 3-month run or a 6-month run or a whole year run. So that's business cards. Now, there were obviously hundreds of other types of advertisements in the newspaper. And one of the things that's most interesting about them to me is that they almost always mention somebody by name. So E.J. Wagner actually named his business after himself, E.J. Wagner and Company. And it tells where it is in Ogden at the post office building, and we are never undersold. We also have a tailor in Vernal, and his name was Earl J. Freeman. Someone else. So even the gas company, which I normally think of as a very large and impersonal company, there was an individual who was willing to go public and take responsibility for the ad and for the company, and that's George R. Horning, way down here at the bottom. So it's kind of surprising that an ad for the gas company, I don't know whether this was, this must have been heating, I think, gas heating and cooking. It's surprising that an individual is associated with it. And if you happen to be related to Mr. Horning, that's very exciting that you can find that here. Here's a realtor company. The address is in Provo is mentioned, the phone number is mentioned, but also not just the president, but all the officers on the board of trustees of this company are mentioned by name. So again, another very rich source for locating people. We have John F. Flower, who's a man who could open or repair safes for you on West Broadway. I'm assuming that's in Salt Lake City, and I'm assuming Wasatch 5926 was a phone number. We have Leslie Ashton's hardware company. It's called the Winchester Store. I can guess that that was because he sold Winchester rifles and ammunition, although I could be wrong about that. This is his Happy New Year greeting. This is fairly large, so this may have been, and because it's Happy New Year, it may have been a one-time only ad that he put in the newspaper. His normal advertisement may have been much smaller and cheaper than this one. Now we'll go up to the classifieds, which were the cheapest type of content that you could pay for in the newspaper. So you all know what classifieds for. These are typically put in by an individual who wants to sell something or trade something or rent or sell. So what's great about these is these names. O.M. Runyon has hides, wools, and furs to sell. So if you happen to be related to that individual, it's very exciting to find out that this is what he sold, and it may lead you to other sources to learn more about him. O.F. Mitchell sold hay and grain. There's a company called Utah Woolen Hides, and there is its address in Ogden. They sold pelts, wool, and furs, and insurance and real estate available from Willard K. One of the cool things about classifieds is it's one of the few places in newspapers where women appear. Women's work and what women did all day often was considered not newsworthy. It was not in the public sphere necessarily. It was in the private sphere. So a lot of times it's hard to find women in newspapers. And what's great about the classifieds is here we have Madame Capiau, who can make a dress for you. Down here, Mrs. H. Lehman can do hem stitching and picot edging for you. And dressmaking, reliable dressmaking for ladies, call here at Plaza Apartments. Another one was marcelling. Marcelling was a way of having your hair curled in about the 1920s and 30s. And again, we have a Mrs. Van Noy who can do that for you. And a Mrs. M.A. Obushan who can actually make a sack lunch for you, which you can pick up on your way to work or stop in at her place on West South Temple and have a meal home cooked by her. So that's a great way to locate individuals. Church news, very common in the papers. The Catholic Church here is telling us that Reverend Father Foley was the pastor. Well, Reverend Father Foley could easily be a member of your extended ancestral family. Over at the Episcopal Church, Reverend D.S. Tuttle was the rector and the bishop. Oops, sorry, I'm going to come back to that. Methodist meetings. Oh, sorry about this. Methodist meetings shows us that Reverend G.M. Pierce was the pastor, and it tells where these meetings were held, and it even tells what he's going to talk about at a certain time. And for the LDS Church, the 20th Ward, in whatever city this is in, Bishop Johnson Sharp is going to preside over the next session. So comings and goings, this is one of my favorite parts of historical newspapers. One of the surprising things, I've been looking at historical American newspapers for about 10 years now, and one of the things that continues to surprise me is how much people got around. I often think of pioneers as being stuck on their farm in North Dakota and never going anywhere, but that's actually not realistic. These people moved around, they relocated, they traveled, they visited one another, they traveled into the city to go shopping. So people were really on the move, and the newspapers are a great place to find people when they're moving around. So in Salt Lake City, we had Townsend House and Salt Lake House. These were the sort of the bigger and fancier hotels in town, and every individual who's checked in on a certain day has listed here by name, including the location where he came from. M.J. Freeman coming all the way from England, S.B. Reed coming from Corinne. So what happened here is that this was news. This person has traveled from Maryland to our town, and even if he's only staying overnight, it's interesting to people. So the local news editor would go to the local hotel or send a gopher to the hotel to open the guest book and copy down the names. And if you remember, if you're older like I am, it used to be when you traveled to a hotel, you literally signed your name in a guest book. And that's what these people did, and that's where this information has come from. We're talking here, and just an announcement that a young man has come home from his mission. So if you were looking for a young man named Caldwell and he's about the right age to have returned from a mission, here's a little bit of information about him. Doesn't have his first name, but you might be able to put two and two together if you had other information. Here's an item in the personals explaining that this businessman, Mr. Altmeyer, of a boot and shoe house in San Francisco, arrived in town yesterday. We also have a Mr. Steele Esquire, who's from San Francisco, arrived in town. And this is interesting to me, F. Kenyon Esquire of the Corinne Journal is in town. So this is one newspaper man announcing to the world that another newspaper man has come to town. This is very common. Newspaper men used to visit one another and chat a lot. So that's probably why Mr. Kenyon is mentioned here. Some more hotel arrivals. The Townsend House we saw before. The American Hotel is yet another hotel. Another list of people who've arrived. Here we have President John Young arriving in town on the 26th, looking well and hearty. I believe this is referring to the railroad President John Young. And it announces not only was he in town on the 26th, but he's already left. He's gone to Colorado. So if you're interested in the travels of this gentleman, this is a very interesting information. Here we have a couple of other individuals mentioned by name of Silver Reef, who stepped into our sanctum and took a view of our office and its surroundings. In this case, the newspaper editor is saying that these people came to the newspaper office to visit us in person. And then we have Elder Wilkinson of Leeds. I don't know if that's Leeds, England, maybe it is, giving us a pleasant visit. He is just recovering from a severe spell of sickness. So great information that's available from these small entries. And John Annan of New York, who was prominent in Utah mining circles. So that's very interesting to anyone who's researching family history in New York or researching mining. And then finally, this list of mustered out soldiers, I really love this. This was published in the Union Vedette, which was published up in the hill above Salt Lake City at Camp Douglas. This is very early on. We're talking about the 1850s or 60s, I'm imagining. So you might be asking, why am I showing you a list of California soldiers? Well, I'm showing you this because I want you to see that you shouldn't limit your search to Utah newspapers. You should expand your search geographically, because just like these folks, your ancestors moved around. They traveled, they took jobs, they worked in mines, they worked in railroads, they were soldiers. So their names are going to appear in other state newspapers just the way these California boys are appearing in this newspaper. Okay, so graduations. What I typically see in these newspapers is graduation from the 8th grade and graduation from high school. So those were the two celebrated graduations. Certainly graduation from college was also celebrated, but these, of course, are more common. Almost everybody made it through 8th grade and almost everybody made it through high school. So you're going to see their names here. What I love about this announcement here is that it's telling the program for the evening, and it's telling what student or what performer is doing what. So this is a great way, not just to find out that Maddie Richards graduated this year in this town, but that she played a piano solo at the performance. It's a great way to find out that R.E. Davidson was the principal of the school. Maybe you knew that he lived there, maybe you didn't know that his job was principal or trustee or bishop. So that's what I love about those announcements. Here's another one. Diplomas were presented to June Christopherson, David Jones, and so on. Again, a big event in the life of a young person that is noted in the local newspaper. Held mail columns, these are really, really useful. They died out when mail delivery got a little more sophisticated, but you see them commonly up until about 1900. And you often see them in big cities, Provo and Salt Lake City and Ogden. You also might see them at the little teeny tiny newspaper in a mining town, because miners were transient. They moved around a lot. And so sometimes for a miner, the only way he can receive mail is if he tells his relatives to mail it to the post office. So mail it to the post office in Vernal, mail it to the post office in Silver Reef. And that's what people did. So the newspaper then would publish a list of their names. The newspaper did get paid a fee to do this. So this is something they did to increase their revenue, but obviously it was public service. And what's surprising sometimes for me is the number of women who show up in these. Someone is trying to reach Susan Mark or Miss Mary Welsh and only knows that the individual is somewhere in Provo and has sent the letter there. Another reason why these were used is if someone lived in a very rural or remote location and there was no mail route to their home. So those individuals might also have to have their mail sent to the post office, and then they would have to go in and pick it up at a certain point. Unclaimed letters, and here's some more. Okay, so one of the biggest sources of content for the newspapers is the government and the law. In some cases, newspapers were paid to publish certain legal notices and governmental notices. Every county had a newspaper sort of on retainer. The newspaper got a regular fee from the county government to publish this kind of information. Some of the things that appear are farm allotments. This is great information because it's showing you the actual section in a township map. You could actually go and find this piece of land, and it's telling you who the allotment went to. Here are some homestead entries. This is back in the day when you had to claim a homestead and live on it for 3 years or 5 years and build up the homestead, like build a house on it. And I love seeing these because these are people who have actually, they've gotten their homestead, they succeeded. And this clerk is announcing that your patent, in other words, the written proof that you are owner of that land, is waiting for you to pick up at the office. So that's all of these people come to the office and pick up your proof that you own that piece of land. And I love this Indian name, Week-a-Gitch, too. Cash entries, I'm actually not entirely sure what that means, cash entries, but again, the newspaper or the county clerk is letting these individuals know something has happened with your claim. In addition, when you filed your claim for a homestead, you actually had to publish in the newspaper for several weeks or months in a row your intent to claim that piece of land. So when you were near the end of your homesteading period and you were going to go in and say, okay, I've done it, I want the title to my land, for several weeks you had to announce to the public that you were going to do that. That gave people who wanted to object to that an opportunity to come forward. And in fact, someone has come forward and is complaining that Mr. Clements of Beaver County actually did not do what he was supposed to do. So this Mr. Ray is a district attorney who has received testimony from someone that Charles Clement did not prove up legally on his land and that he should not get that land patent. This is an announcement, I think, of a lawsuit. We have a joint stock corporation in Salt Lake City as a plaintiffs, and we have a couple, Abel and Rachel, as the defendants, to be sold at sheriff's sale. So I think what's happening here is this couple has gone bankrupt and the sheriff has taken over all their property and is going to sell it at the courthouse in Fillmore on a particular day. So if you happen to be related to the Ropers, this is really a lot of information about them. If they're one of those families that used to be in a town and then suddenly disappeared from that town, this kind of information is really helpful. I can tell you maybe what motivated them to move on. Here we have another lawsuit. Frank Hoffman issued a suit against Thomas Menard to determine the rights to a particular mining claim. You see these hundreds of these in Utah newspapers, of course. I've been looking at newspapers, as I mentioned, for about 10 years. The earliest papers that I've seen are these Utah papers from 1850. But I've also seen papers in Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming. And I can tell you I have yet to see a newspaper issue that does not have an ad for an attorney. So attorneys were present from the very beginning and were busy from the very beginning. Here we have a pedestrian, Mary Hooper, who is suing the city because she stumbled on the sidewalk and fractured her arm. Great, interesting piece of detail about her. And some additional lawsuits. This is actually a divorce suit. Fern Laven Stevens Railsec is asking for divorce from Lakey Armentile Railsec. for drunkenness. So those are great. Here's a few more. Whenever real estate changed hands, there was some kind of public acknowledgement of that. I don't know whether it was a legal requirement that the attorneys had to file, or if it was just considered so newsworthy that the newspaper covered it. But in any case, when real estate changed hands, you will see an announcement in the newspaper. So that's something to look for. Also, some of these really seemingly boring articles, like they're doing road work, or they're fixing the pavement, or they're fixing a bridge. These things seem like they're kind of boring and irrelevant, but what's great about them is they often mention individual laborers who are working on the project, managers who have come to manage the project temporarily and are staying at the hotel. That kind of thing is really kind of gold in terms of information about family history. Here's an application for mineral rights for someone's got a mining claim, essentially, and it tells the name of the company and the name of the lawyer that the company is using. Here, the Lehigh Banner is one of those county newspapers that I mentioned that actually is the official county newspaper, and it was paid by the county to publish certain information so that the county could fulfill its own obligation to make things public. And here, the Lehigh Banner is publishing the names of all the officers of the city. So this is great information, appeared in every single issue, and it's wonderful. Legal notice here. This is a petroleum company. I don't know whether that means it was a heating oil company or what, and I'm not entirely sure what's happening here, but we do have people's names. We know this was in Ogden. We know that these people had certificate and a certain number of shares. And we also know that they are in arrears. These individuals are delinquent, so they owe this money. And I'm not entirely sure what's happening here. If the individuals who were in a certain area owned shares in the local petroleum company and then had to pay some kind of monthly fee or annual fee to keep their share current. I'm just not entirely sure, but in any case, the list of names is what's so special here. And the delinquent tax lists. Here's two of them. These are really wonderful because they often have very specific descriptions of the piece of land that's being taxed. They obviously have the name of the taxpayer and what the taxpayer owes. In other words, what is due to the city or the state or the county. You see these typically appearing at the end of the year in December. This county or the state was required to publish this list. Sometimes they go on for many, many pages, but this is a great way not just to see that your relative owned land, but to see where they owned land and for how long. So letters to the editor. Your ancestors may easily have submitted a letter to the editor. So letters to the editor were not really common very early on. You might see one or two in the papers, in the big papers like the Deseret News or the Salt Lake Trib, 1850 to 1890s. And you see many more of them after the turn of the 20th century. But for some papers, small rural papers, letters to the editor often were not part of the paper. So this is kind of a crapshoot whether there are going to be any letters to the editor in a particular newspaper, but it's great when there are, because not only do you get to see the person's name, but you get to hear his voice in the sense that he wrote this letter and you get an idea of what kind of person he was and what he believed. So we talked about graduations, but all kinds of other school events were also talked about. And what's great about this announcement, which is talking about something happening at the University of Utah, actually, is that the number of people are mentioned in this short bit here. B.H. Roberts lectured to the missionary class. We have Professor Mills will be working at Harvard University. We have a Professor John T. Miller who will become the chair of the history department. So not just students, but the people who were running and working and teaching at the university are also mentioned. Another community event were the annual parades that were held. There might have been one for Pioneer Day, there might have been one for the 4th of July, as this one is. And what I love about this is not only does it tell us that this town had a 4th of July celebration, but it gives us the names of the townspeople who were involved in organizing it. That's really wonderful. And here's more detail about this same 4th of July celebration. And apparently there was a parade or a procession, and people were playing roles in that procession. So it's great to see that, say, Charles Caron was probably carrying the flag of our country. Mrs. A.E. Jones was portraying the Goddess of Liberty. Mr. J.M. Anderson was portraying Uncle Sam. So again, wonderful, wonderful detail about these individuals and how they participated in their community. Here's a couple more: an Eagle Scout passing his Eagle Scout test, and a musical concert, a recital, and the students and what each of them is doing. So sports obviously were a big part of newspapers. National and international sports, if they were of interest, were covered, but also local amateur sports and school sports. So here we have a list of female basketball players for one team, Fremont, and the other, Hamilton. Again, another list. The teams are the U of U and MIL. I honestly don't know what school MIL is representing here. Maybe one of you knows. Somewhere at the college or university level. And here are the full names of these basketball players. And again, the football contest between football tournament between a team composed of residents of the bench and a team made up of citizens from the lower part of town. The bench team and the second ward team are all mentioned by name. Wonderful photographs often appear in the sports pages. So those are great. So the personals is another place where wonderful personal detail about individuals appears, and you may find your ancestors there. I'm sometimes asked about the personal column and if it was a gossip column. And my answer is that gossip columns were a different animal from this. Personals were announcements that the individual involved wanted to be known. And oftentimes the individual is the one who gave this piece of information to the newspaper. They would literally walk into the newspaper office and say, my cousin's visiting, do you want to announce it in the paper? She's from Iowa, or whatever. These personals were almost always positive or supportive in some way. It's very unusual to see anything negative in here because, of course, the individuals themselves are the people who've provided the information. But also, oftentimes, the newspaper man in a small town particularly played other roles. He may have also had a law practice on the side. And it would not do for that newspaper man to alienate his own subscribers and the townspeople themselves. So you don't see sort of scandalous announcements or negative things or hints that somebody has done something wrong. So in that sense, the personals are not gossip columns as we normally think of them. The gossip columns are at least the way I think of them, are kind of the Walter Winchell type columns. They typically occurred in big cities, New York City or Chicago or Los Angeles. And the subjects of gossip columns were the wealthy and the well-known. So in other words, they weren't just any average Joe. Those gossip columnists targeted famous people, and they often hinted at negative or scandalous things that were happening in those celebrities' lives. But we don't really see that in our hometown papers in Utah. Okay, and finally, if you still are not finding your ancestors in all of this information, one other way to find them is if they actually owned livestock, horses or cows or sheep, and those animals wandered around. Sometimes you can locate your family that way. So, for example, the Astray notices is where these things were published. It was a big section back in the classified ads, and there would be dozens or hundreds of these notices there on a given week. So here, Mr. Richard Mills, who's living in the 11th Ward, is saying that a light brindle cow and calf broke into his lot, and he's describing them: a Spanish brand on offside, an A on the right hip, a 7 on the right horn. Well, if you happen to know how your family livestock was branded at a certain time period, this is great information for you because it will show you that your family must have lived nearby, because here the cow and the calf wandered into Mr. Mills' lot. We also know that Mr. Mills of the 11th Ward tells us something about him. He must have had livestock of his own because he had a lot where these animals wandered in. And of course, he's saying, come and claim your cow and calf and pay me for what I've done to take care of them in the meantime. Here's another estray notice. This is put in by the pound keeper himself. Looks like this is a 13-pound black mare. So nobody has claimed this animal, and it's going to be auctioned at a certain day, at a certain time by the pound keeper. And again, here's another black mare and a bald-faced horse. Excuse me. Mr. Elmer Jackson in Lehigh at the pound is saying, I have these items, come and get them if these belong to you. So. Okay, so I promised you to go over some searching tips, and you're really running out of time, so I'm going to go quickly through these. So I want you to remember there's no right or perfect way to search a repository like this. You know that optical character recognition is what has been used to create the search, and you know that that's not 100% perfect. So it's going to be important for you to experiment, try different things, keep trying. Remember to search for multiple terms. Railway and railroad would both be used. Remember to use terms that were contemporaneous at that time. So you're not going to see the term biracial in the 19th century, but you might see the term mulatto. And baseball was once spelled as two words, basketball with a hyphen in it. Typesetting shortcuts is really interesting to me. You know, these newspapers were put together with metal slugs, and a given newspaper staff had a limited number of those pieces of type. They would have lots of E's and O's because when you're going to publish a newspaper in the English language, you need lots of E's and O's, but they might have fewer Y's and fewer Z's because they just weren't going to need that many. Well, in case of an Irish name like McNulty, if you can picture a large article about a large McNulty family where many McNultys are being mentioned, and the word McNulty has to appear over and over again in that article, you can see how the typesetter quickly could run out of C's when he didn't expect to. And he can't afford to do that because in addition to laying out this article about the McNultys, he has to lay out the rest of the newspaper page. And he's probably going to need some C's to lay out the rest of the newspaper page. So a typesetter shortcut is when he just gave up and said, okay, I'm just going to let them figure out it's McNulty. I'm just going to use the M and this apostrophe every time I have to publish McNulty because I need my C's for the rest of the paper. We talked about proximity searching earlier, and I just want to mention how well this can do if you get too many results. Using proximity search can help you narrow that down a little bit. I also mentioned that you shouldn't limit your search geographically. Don't stick with one town or one county newspaper. Don't even stick with Utah newspapers. These folks traveled around. Another thing that happened is that newspapers exchanged pieces with one another. They got free mail. They could mail their newspaper to a colleague in another county or another state at no charge. The U.S. Postal Service allowed them to do that. And so it was common for newspapers to literally cut something out of somebody else's newspaper, and if it was a funny anecdote or an interesting item, they would retypeset it and put it in their own newspaper. And they often would credit the original newspaper. So you might see an announcement from the newspaper of Vernal, Utah, appearing in a Nevada paper. And that's because of this newspaper exchange. These newspapers were being mailed all over the place all the time. So that's why I say don't limit your search to Utah, because some of our early newspapers have not survived, but a notice that appeared in a Vernal newspaper or a St. George newspaper, the only place that you may find that notice now is in a Nevada paper or an Arizona paper, because it was interesting and that out-of-state editor copied it and put it in his own newspaper. So you're really going to have to broaden your search geographically. I think you know that we are in the more casual era now, but in the old days, people were known by their initials or their title. Usually if someone was a doctor or a judge or held public office like a mayor, they would invariably be referred to as Judge Johnson or Mayor Smith, not usually with their first name, but with their title. So, and also if you were looking for a common name like A.B. Smith and this individual was a junior or a senior, you can try and include that. It could help you narrow down results a little bit. And finally, the last tip I have is to come back to this resource after you've had some time away from it and rerun your search. We are adding more content to Utah digital newspapers every day. So a search that you ran 1 year ago would produce a certain set of search results. If you redid that search, the very same search today, your search results would be different. You'd have more results and you might have more relevant results. Okay, so now we're going to get on to the sneak preview part, what's actually in UDN and what's coming. So what we've recently added, we are in the process of adding 100 years of the Provo Herald. This paper was a semi-weekly at the very beginning, but quickly became a daily, sometimes published during the day, sometimes published at night, and also sometimes published concurrently with a big fat Sunday edition, which ran from the 1920s to the 1950s, I think. So it's a big job, but we're about 85% through that job. So if you have Provo or Utah Valley ancestors, the Provo Herald is a wonderful resource. We've also added these more recent runs of the Jordan Valley Sentinel and the Midvale Sentinel. These short runs of the Ogden Examiner and the Salt Lake Telegram, you can see it's only a few months for each one. This is a case where we digitized this newspaper, but for some reason these months were skipped. So this is a case of us going back to fill in a gap in our own digitized newspapers. The Ogden Junction was a wonderful, eccentric, cool paper in the 1870s, and we have every surviving issue that we could find. We have digitized and added to our resource, UDN. And then finally, something else that's very exciting is the Women's Exponent. This newspaper ran for 30 odd years. It was always edited, published by a woman. It's staffed by women. And its subject matter was targeted at women. In particular, it was the publication of the Ladies' Aid Society for the Latter-day Saint Church. This was a very active women's group. They did a lot of things, and one of the things they did was organize very large and elaborate and successful charity projects. So you can see that that work is documented in this newspaper. The other thing that the newspaper served was almost a way to feed the intellectual and spiritual life of women in particular. So you see a lot of carefully written long articles and essays. I mean, I'm sure they talked about family events, child rearing, and housekeeping, but they also appealed to other interests in these women's lives, and that's what's exciting about this newspaper. I'm just going to show you the first page of the first issue. Volume 1, number 1 was 1872. You can click through here over at the right to each page in the issue. This issue is only 8 pages long, but sometimes these issues ran to 30 or 40 pages. So again, another place to find women in particular mentioned, and whatever activity they were keeping busy with, described oftentimes at length. You'll also find obituaries of women who were prominent in the Ladies' Aid Society, and those obituaries describe not just who she was married to and who she gave birth to, they describe the projects that she organized, the actual work for society that she did. So that's very exciting, and that's something that we've added to our site. Okay, sneak preview, what's coming up. So very soon we will be adding the Emory County Progress 1940 to 1980 onto our website. And shortly after that, you should see the Moab paper, the Times Independent, from 1979 to 2005. We have other runs of both of these papers, so we're essentially adding on to what we already have. And then I want to talk about something that we call the embargo deal, which is an arrangement that we have made, Marriott Library has made with Ancestry.com. Ancestry owns the website newspapers.com. So in 2019, we will be giving to newspapers.com, their offices are in Lehigh at the main Ancestry offices, all the microfilm for all of these newspapers. Come back. So Bingham Bulletin, Bingham News, all the way down to the Weber State Signpost. That's the student paper for Weber State. We'll be giving the microfilm to them to digitize. They're going to digitize it for free. In exchange for digitizing it for free, they're going to get to put it on their website, newspapers.com, right away. Now, we cannot add it to our free website, Utah Digital Newspapers, for 3 years. And that's what we mean by when we say embargo. The content is embargoed for 3 years. And that gives Ancestry.com an opportunity to recoup the costs that they invested in digitizing all of this, since they're not going to get paid to digitize it. But they will add it immediately to their own website, which, as you know, is a subscription website. but you will also have access to that same information, those same 34 runs of newspapers immediately, as soon as they're digitized. So that will be this year, 2019. And to get access, you'll need to physically go to one of our institutions of higher education. Here's the list of universities and colleges. And also you can go to the State Division of History or the State Library. Physically go to these places, to their library, and use one of their computers. And you'll have access to a special newspapers.com subscription that allows you to see and use and search all of these new content. So this is the first part of this embargo deal. We're going to be doing this over several years with newspapers.com. And that's one of the ways that we want to increase the percentage of Utah newspapers that have been digitized. Very quickly, there are 3 wonderful videos about historical newspapers in the United States on YouTube. They're not about genealogy, and they're not about searching. They're about how newspapers were founded, how were they published, what was the point of having a newspaper. And there are 3 different ones covering different aspects of American newspaper history. Very, very good, produced by the University of Illinois. There's also some more resources here, and since this slideshow will be available on YouTube, you'll be able to come back and have a look at these resources. I wanted to remind you that you can contact us at any time on the website using that contact link at the top. We'd love to hear from you. That's the end of my presentation. I'm going to show you that list of papers one more time. This is the preview of what's coming up in 2019. Very exciting, and some wonderful papers we're going to be adding. So that's really all I have today. Thank you for listening, and I hope this is useful to you, and do contact us. Good night.
All right. Thank you so much for joining us today. We hope that you'll join us next week for our webinar, which will be on Wednesday, June 12th, with Joe Price. If you have any comments or questions, you can always email us at fhl_webinars@byu.edu or follow our Facebook and Twitter. Thank you, and have a wonderful weekend.